Good afternoon. Welcome to today's lunch at the library with Sebastián Gil-Riaño. My name is Adriana Link, and I am Assistant Director of Library and Museum Programming here at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. Very happy to welcome all of you here today, both in person and online. Really glad to see you all here. I actually can't see you, but you can see me. So we have the chat going. Please put in questions. Very happy to have you with us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the traditional homeland of the Lenape people, whose ancestral relationships and connections with this land continue to this day and into the future. The APS wishes to express its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous indigenous communities and individuals throughout this continent who have offered guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration that make the work of the APS's Library and Museum possible. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, and I know we do have some first-time visitors here, which is fantastic, the APS was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743 to support the promotion of useful knowledge. Election to APS membership honors those who have made significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year to individuals who are working on projects that span the arts, humanities, and sciences. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. And if you haven't already, please do check out our website to learn more about all of our events, goings-on, new collection highlights. There's a lot of stuff going on here these days, so please do take a moment to take a look if you haven't lately. Today, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Sebastián Gil-Riaño, who is assistant professor, although newly promoted. So are you associate now officially? July 1st, soon to be Associate Professor of History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania, who will be talking about his new book, The Remnants of Race Science, UNESCO and Economic Development in the Global South. There are some flyers on the tables with discount codes. If you'd like to purchase a copy, they are 20% off with the code. And for those of you who are joining us online, we'll put that code in the chat as well. So when I first learned that Sebastián was working on this book, I honestly could not wait to include it as part of the programming series here at the APS. His book offers an important contribution to scholarship and the history of the human sciences on how global organizations like UNESCO sought to reframe understandings of race and racial prejudice in the aftermath of World War II. As he'll discuss in more detail momentarily, his work also shows how these efforts inadvertently helped legitimize projects of post-war modernization and economic development, particularly in the global South. So many of the scientists and experts involved with these conversations have personal papers and correspondence that are housed here within the collections of the APS's Library and Museum. These include figures such as evolutionary biologist Julian Huxley, who served as UNESCO's first director, Ashley Montague, who was one of the drafters of the 1950 Statement on Race, as well as geneticists like Elsie Dunn, Theodosius Dobzhansky, and Kurt Stern, who offered important critiques on the statement. So I hope you can see why I was so enthusiastic about having Sebastián here today, and I hope you will join me in welcoming him to the stage for his presentation. So Sebastián, come on up.
Thank you so much to Adriana for that wonderful introduction and for organizing this event. And you've made my task easier by sort of setting the stage and the scene so nicely. And I'm seeing a lot of new faces, as well as some faces that I'm more familiar with. So it's really nice to see sort of this combination of folks here. I hope you will continue to be interested in the book after the talk, and do check out the flyer. So what I want to do today is just offer a sort of quick teaser of the book. I'm going to describe some of the book's key interventions and drop into some of the key episodes of the book before opening the floor to you. And I'm going to jump right in. So a few months, let me see if this is working first. There we go. A few months after releasing the controversial 1950 UNESCO Statement on Race, the UNESCO Courier published an article titled An Indian Girl with a Lesson for Humanity. The article celebrated the heights of human potential through the story of Marie-Yvonne Veillard, an Indian girl, quote unquote, born into the nomadic Guayaqui tribe in Paraguay, yet raised by the French scientist Jean-Albert Veillard, her adoptive father. With a sense of awe, the article's author explained that Marie-Yvonne came from, quote, one of the most primitive tribes on earth, yet quickly transformed into a civilized French girl who now, at the age of 20, worked as a laboratory assistant to her adoptive father, a renowned expert in physical and medical anthropology. The article was penned by Alfred Métraux, who's pictured there on the right, a Swiss-born and French-trained anthropologist who specialized in Amerindian ethnohistory and served as director of UNESCO's race campaign in the 1950s. To explain how Marie-Yvonne ascended to the privileged world of laboratory science, Métraux appealed to one of the 20th century human science's most influential concepts, the cultural environment. Had she not been adopted at the age of 2 by a French scientist, Métraux conjectured, Marie-Yvonne would have been condemned to grow up in a, quote, primitive and rudimentary culture that wanders at large in the forest, hunting and gathering, and whose way of life is very little different from that of the first bands of men who colonized the empty spaces of South America thousands of years ago. Yet thanks to being, quote, brought up exactly as a white girl, Métraux explained, Marie-Yvonne became, quote, an attractive, intelligent girl of 20 and a typical product of the cultural environment in which she has lived for 18 years. For Métraux, Marie-Yvonne's story offered compelling evidence for convincing the layperson of the arguments put forward in UNESCO's 1950 Statement on Race. Above all, Métraux argued, Marie-Yvonne's story proved one of the 1950 statement's most important points, that, quote, given similar degrees of cultural opportunity to realize their potentialities, the average achievement of the members of each ethnic group is about the same. My book describes 2 overlapping histories encapsulated in Métraux's article and in UNESCO's race initiatives in the decades following World War II. The first narrative concerns the history of race science and how scientific experts from Latin America, Oceania, Europe, and North America sought to replace older and essentializing conceptions of human difference with purportedly more objective ones. This familiar story of retreating racial ideas is encapsulated in the way Métraux presented Marie-Yvonne's story as offering a decisive rejoinder to the rigid hereditary claims of scientific racism. Yet, in his attempt to confront racism, Métraux identified European civilization and, ultimately, whiteness as key metrics of achievement and progress. Métraux's article thus points to a more complex history of combating racism, a history in which racism was framed as illogical and irrational, and thereby concealed as an operating force in scientific inquiry and humanitarian practice. Métraux's article also contains another historical discourse not typically present in historiographic treatments of race science. Marie-Yvonne's transformation supposedly offered a lesson not just for UNESCO readers, but for humanity as a whole. If a young girl from one of the world's most primitive tribes could ascend to such heights, why not the rest of the world's quote-unquote backwards peoples? By exalting Marie-Yvonne's cultural transformation, Métraux's article offered a narrative that vindicated the ambitious projects of third world economic development that were also central to the mission of the United Nations system. Thus encapsulated in Métraux's article is also a history of how scientific arguments about human equipotential helped transform the once overtly racial civilizing mission ideologies of European imperialism into the seemingly non-racial discourse of international development. In examining the intertwined histories of anti-racist science and international development, my book takes heed of historian and anthropologist Anne Stoller's searing challenge to historical studies of racism. In her influential essay, Racial Histories and Their Regimes of Truth, Stoller observed that scholarly accounts of contemporary racism tend to be predicated on flattened and reductive histories of what racism once looked like. According to Stoller, these reductive histories of racism have typically assumed that racism once existed in a more overt and biological form that has since given way to a more complex and culturally coded racism in the present. By taking this contrast between racism's past and present for granted, Stoller argues, anti-racist histories of racism have often become scholarly quests for the original moment in which the die of race was cast. Anti-racist histories have thus been guided by the belief that racism can be dismantled by identifying its internal contradictions and by pinpointing its historical origins. And it is this quest for origins, Stoller contends, that explains why anti-racist histories have typically appeared as narratives of redemption, narratives that seek to identify the moment of original sin and thus absolve the present from the misguided racism of the past. For a long time, historical accounts of race science favored a similarly redemptive narrative, describing a decisive retreat of scientific racism after World War II. According to this retreat narrative, the period after 1945 marked a firm break with the preceding century and a half where racism thrived and was legitimated through scientific research programs that presumed fixed racial hierarchies rooted in anatomical and hereditary differences. Instead of narrating a definitive retreat of racial thought, my book, The Remnants of Race Science, describes a more complex transnational project, often led by scientists from the global south, and a project concerned with aligning conceptions of race and human difference with post-colonial projects of economic development and social integration. While this transformation in racial thought has conventionally been described as marking the disappearance of static racial typologies, The Remnants of Race reveals how scientific experts simultaneously revived assumptions about race from the Southern Hemisphere that emphasized practices such as race mixing and acculturation to European norms as strategies of post-colonial nation building. And I just want to point out that a lot of this framing and usage of the Global South comes from the time I spent at the University of Sydney, where I spent 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow in a laureate fellowship on race and ethnicity in the Global South. The Remnants of Race examines this shift by tracing the history of UNESCO's race campaign after 1945. Through an international campaign that sought to educate people worldwide about the differences between conceptions of race anchored in science and those mired in ideology, UNESCO became a key player in the post-1945 shift in racial thought. Yet instead of describing UNESCO's campaign as signifying a major rupture point, my book illustrates how it drew from conceptions of race that were common to the development schemes of independent nations and European colonies in the Southern Hemisphere. These Southern conceptions of race emphasized the plasticity and alterability of racial groups and thus stood in stark contrast to the rigid conceptualizations of Mendelian eugenicists. Yet this emphasis on plasticity and above all racial improvement was also conveniently aligned with the UN system emphasis, the system's emphasis on economic development and global health in the newly coined Third World. Thus, what my book makes visible are the continuities between colonial and post-colonial projects of racial improvement and the international development and global health industry that flourished through the UN and its allied agencies after World War II. As such, my book situates the history of race science and its alleged decline within the history of applied social science projects of modernization, acculturation, social hygiene, and mestizaje that proliferated in the Southern Hemisphere during the 20th century. So my book is structured around 3 parts, and I'm not going to go into any detail describing them, but what I'm going to do for the remainder of the talk is move to the second part of the book, where I follow the trajectories of some of the key actors who participated in drafting UNESCO's race statements. I follow their trajectories during the Cold War and show how closely involved they became with economic development schemes that retained heavily racialized conceptions of indigenous peoples. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to take us to a key episode from this second part of my book that takes place in the high altitude environment of the Peruvian Andes. I'm just gonna take a quick sip here. If the plan now under consideration does bear fruit, wrote Alfred Métraux in 1955 for the UNESCO Courier, its first result will be to bring to the surface the latent energy, sobriety, and courage of the Andean Indian. The plan in question was an initiative sponsored by Peru's military-backed government and the International Labor Organization. The initiative, or the plan, was to colonize the Tambopata Valley with, quote, Aymara Indians from the overcrowded banks of Lake Titicaca, where population density may reach 150 persons per square mile. In Métraux's estimation, this scheme could ease the land hunger afflicting the Titicaca region and accelerate economic development of Aymara Indians by furnishing them with fertile agricultural terrain. In Bolivia, the revolutionary government of Victor Paz Estensoro, which had adopted an ambitious program of agrarian reform, implemented a similar scheme with ILO assistance, International Labor Organization. Yet in Peru, Métraux lamented, the colonization of the Tambopata Valley, a semi-tropical region near the Amazon basin, provoked controversy because it had become accepted. It had become an accepted belief, almost a dogma, that, quote, life in the warm lowlands is fatal to Andean Indians. According to Métraux, the main scientific proponent of these dogmatic beliefs was Dr. Carlos Monge, the famous Peruvian physiologist who had devoted a lifetime to proving that the lungs and other organs of Indians living at high altitude have been modified by evolution and adapted to rarefied air. While Métraux wagered that the resettlement project would unleash the latent economic potential of Lake Titicaca's indigenous inhabitants, Monge warned that the Tambopata Valley's tropical climate could unsettle Andean highlanders' delicate state of racial acclimatization and disrupt ancient biosocial customs that dated back to the Inca Empire. If transplanted to the tropics, Monge cautioned, Andean Indians were prone to suffer from, quote, tropical fatigue and were likely to contract particularly acute forms of pulmonary tuberculosis. Andean Indians' economic development would be better served, Monge insisted, by keeping them in the highlands. By invoking the physiological specificity of Andean Indians and their right to remain in the highlands, Monge echoed the work of interwar indigenistas, such as Luis Valcarcel and José Mariátegui, who championed Andean Indians and the Inca Empire in opposition to intellectual elites from Lima who viewed Andean highlanders as racially degenerate. Yet from the vantage of UNESCO's race campaign that Métraux had directed since 1950, Monge's belief in a distinct Andean racial type struck a discordant note. Instead of denouncing racial typologies as the 1950 and 1951 UNESCO statements on race had done, Monge's arguments seemed to reintroduce new physiological ones and thus revive the very race science that UNESCO experts were attempting to bury. So I'm just going to sort of briefly outline kind of the genesis of this debate and sort of the different positions that emerged. The idea that Peru's highlands suffered from a unique demographic crisis called land hunger comes from the work of Peruvian medical experts from the interwar period who promoted social medicine and eugenics as scientific approaches to combating Peru's social problems. During the interwar period, medical experts from Lima began to champion hygiene and sanitation as means of racial improvement. and it was in this context that medical experts from Lima began to adopt the labels of eugenics and social medicine to describe an ambitious public health program to modernize Peru's backward regions and populations. Perhaps the most prominent Peruvian eugenicist was Carlos Enriquez Paz Soldan, pictured here on the left, who served as a professor of hygiene and director of the Institute of Social Medicine at the National University of San Marcos in Lima. Paz Soldan celebrated Peru's cosmopolitanism, but also worried that the prevalence of infectious diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, and smallpox had caused racial degeneration among Peru's, quote, infinite variety of races, castes, and ethnic mixtures, and rendered the white race impotent in its ability to assert its ethnic superiority and aptitude for nation building. Those are Paz Soldan's words. Paz Soldan therefore promoted a holistic conception of social medicine that took what he called settler ethnic groups and their relation to geocosmic social environments as its object of study. By understanding the relation between Peru's different populations and their environments, Paz Soldan believed that social medicine could decipher the general laws that presided over the adaptation, persistence, and perfection of humanity. For him, the basic logic that underpinned social medicine was one that shared eugenics' concern with the biological enhancement of the human race. From this expansive conception of social medicine, Paz Soldan led South American efforts to confront U.S. eugenic projects and their racist logics. As the historian of Latin America, Nancy Steppen, noted, Paz Soldan played a prominent role in the Pan-American sanitary conferences from the late 1920s, where Latin American medical experts rallied together to resist what they viewed as U.S. scientists' narrow and hereditarian conceptions of eugenics. Although Paz Soldan and others used the term eugenics at international forums, in the domestic context of Peru, they tended to use it much less. Indeed, when they looked to the Andean highlands and Amazon basin, social medicine practitioners did not typically frame their efforts in eugenic terms. Instead, these geographically distant regions prompted them to use notions of social hygiene and colonization to make sense of their seeming underdevelopment. In an effort to develop these regions, practitioners of social medicine conducted state-sponsored socio-medical surveys of the Peruvian Amazon and the Andean highlands, which aimed to unleash these regions' economic potential by building a public health infrastructure and roads. They also cautiously encouraged the migration of Andean highlanders to other regions with adequate public health support. A striking example of these colonization efforts can be seen in the work of the German physician Maxim Kudzinski-Godard, whom Metro would later cite when he wrote about land hunger in the UNESCO Courier. Kudzinski-Godard, who's pictured here on the right, from 1938 to 1944, he led several sanitary campaigns to the Amazon region under the auspices of Paz Soldan's Institute of Social Medicine. Kudzinski-Godard, who was Jewish, had joined the ISM, the Institute of Social Medicine, as a laboratory chief in 1936 after fleeing Germany due to racial persecution from the Nazi regime. He had previously served as a professor of pathology at the University of Berlin, where he had trained in medicine and anthropology. During the 1940s, under the auspices of the Institute of Social Medicine and with support from the Peruvian government, Kudzinski-Godard conducted several socio-medical surveys of the Amazon and Andes regions. Drawing from his training in medicine and anthropology, Kudzinski-Godard surveyed the diseases and cultural practices of indigenous inhabitants of these regions and described the groups he encountered as, quote, backward, malnourished, and unhygienic. Through these expeditions, Kudzinski-Godard honed the idea that building a public health infrastructure was crucial to the development of the Amazon and Andes regions and their integration into the rest of the country. Echoing language later adopted by Métro, Kosinski-Godard wrote about sparking a, quote, evolutionary process in the Amazon that would liberate, quote, Amazonian man from poverty and servitude and unleash the capacities that lay dormant due to a harsh physical and social environment. He also insisted that modernizing the Amazon would have to be more humane towards the region's indigenous inhabitants and avoid the carnage of the rubber industry. In his work on the Andes region, Kosinski-Godard wrote about the unhealthy and unhygienic customs and practices of the region's indigenous inhabitants and described a pattern of migration to other regions that purportedly posed a public health threat to the nation. For instance, he described a pattern of what he called migrations and oscillations, where men and youth from Puno in the Andes traveled to warmer regions to cultivate and import fresh fruit and coffee, and to cities to look for seasonal work. He also cautioned that these migrations posed a growing public health threat. When migrants returned to the Andes, they often brought diseases such as tuberculosis, leishmaniasis, and intestinal parasites that were deteriorating the general health of Andean populations. In view of the migrants' primitive ways of life and lack of hygienic control, Kosinski-Godard wrote, a situation has emerged that is full of risks and renders each migrant group a virtual vector of contagion. The solutions to this challenging situation, he insisted, were straightforward. The Peruvian Ministry of Health could control the situation and secure the future prosperity and health of the nation if it increased the number of rural doctors in the region and trained more subaltern sanitary personnel. Echoing his proposals for the Amazonian region, Kosinski-Godard suggested that the challenges posed by the Andean region's itinerant indigenous populations was of a technical order that required the intervention of more medical experts and the creation of a more robust public health infrastructure. After World War II, Kosinski-Godard's ideas about land hunger in the Andes gained currency in the context of international economic development projects which targeted the indigenous populations of the Andes. By the 1950s, the political and economic fate of the Andes region became a matter of growing international concern. In 1952, Bolivia experienced a social revolution led by Victor Paz Estenssoro, who introduced an agrarian reform program that redistributed land and led to the destruction of the country's landed oligarchy. While Victor Paz Estenssoro's government refused to pick sides in the growing ideological conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and welcomed aid from both nations, the dictatorship of Manuel Odria in Peru was closely aligned with the U.S. government and took strong pro-capitalist measures. These included outlawing the leftist APRA party, which was designed to encourage U.S. investment in the mining and petroleum sectors. The differing fates of these Andean countries and the potential for socialist revolution attracted close interest from the U.S. and from UN agencies, which resulted in the articulation of international development projects that doubled as communist containment strategies. These tensions can be observed in the ILO's, the International Labor Organization's, Andean Indian Program, the broader regional development project of which the Puno Tambopata Resettlement Project was one part. So the Andean Indian Program ran between 1952 and 1972 and was one of the ILO's most ambitious endeavors of the Cold War era. It aimed to accelerate the economic development of Andean countries and assumed that the large indigenous populations in the highlands posed an obstacle to this process. As a solution to this perceived social problem, the ILO and other UN agencies worked closely with Andean nations to create a series of action bases whose purpose was to transform the Aymara and Quechua inhabitants of the highlands into modern economic subjects. Like proponents of social medicine, ILO officials viewed issues concerning the economic development of Andean highlanders as primarily technical issues and embraced non-biological conceptions of race that emphasized the social dimensions of cultural change. In the mid-1950s, at the height of the AIP's operation, the Andean Indian Program, Jeff Renz, the ILO's deputy director, mused that the progress made during the project gave proof that, quote, indigenous populations are perfectly capable of being transformed quickly into excellent producers and conscientious and active citizens. And this, the map here on the left comes from one of the booklets that the project produced and gives you a sense of the different action bases that were created, as well as the idea of resettling groups from the highlands to the lower-lying tropical valley. From the earliest stages of the Andean Indian Program, Kaczynski-Goddard's theme of land hunger on the shores of Lake Titicaca became a focal point for the project and framed the field reports of the director of the first field mission, Ernst Beaglehole, an ethnopsychologist from New Zealand, who's the towering figure in the middle of this image here. It is not clear why Beaglehole was chosen to lead this mission, as he was not trained as a Latin Americanist and had not worked in the region. Yet by the late 1940s, he began to play a prominent role within UN agencies. Beaglehole had formed part of the committee of scientists that drafted the 1950 UNESCO Statement on Race, and 2 years later, Beaglehole became New Zealand's representative to the ILO's Committee of Experts on Indigenous Labor. And after the first meeting of this committee in La Paz in 1951, Beaglehole was chosen to lead the field mission that initiated the Andean Indian Program. Since the late 1930s, Beaglehole's research had focused on the psychological impacts of Western culture on Polynesian islanders and the Maori in New Zealand. Much of this work was influenced by culture and personality studies in anthropology and emphasized the psychological struggles and social disintegration that indigenous youth faced as they struggled to adapt to European ways of life. In the Andean context, however, Beaglehole ended up placing much less emphasis on questions of psychological adaptation and instead focused on the region's geographic extremes and the size and distribution of its indigenous populations as obstacles to economic development. In his report on his field mission, Beaglehole used dramatic language to describe a bleak situation in which geographic and colonial forces conspired to isolate indigenous communities and render them economically unproductive. For instance, Beaglehole estimated that the average population density of the Andean region was 20 inhabitants per square kilometer. Yet, in some of the region's most favored areas on the shores of Lake Titicaca, primarily inhabited by Aymara communities, the population density rose to as much as 76 inhabitants per square kilometer. According to Beaglehole, these alarming rates of population density were putting acute pressures on land resources and had given rise to a situation where only about half a hectare of land per person was devoted to agriculture. Echoing Kaczynski-Goddard, Beaglehole observed that these acute population pressures had prompted the region's inhabitants to resort to, quote, random and disorganized migratory movements throughout the region. Although the sparsely populated and low-lying tropical valleys in the Amazon basin offered what seemed to Beaglehole like a logical destination for these migrants, he noted that, quote, the prevalence of malaria and other tropical diseases deterred them from coming in large numbers. So it was within the context of questions like these about the region's poorly distributed indigenous population that the idea for the resettlement project began to take shape. Yet, Beaglehole's report did not offer an unqualified endorsement of the project, but rather cautiously argued for further studies. Indeed, Beaglehole wrote that transferring groups from congested districts of the Altiplano to the undeveloped and potentially fertile lands at lower latitudes seemed like a tempting solution, yet he also insisted that a realistic attitude toward the plan was necessary and stressed that such transference must inevitably be costly and riddled with obstacles. Chief amongst these obstacles, he noted that altiplano inhabitants had their own specific physical constitution, which rendered their adaptation to lower altitudes difficult and somewhat lengthy, and that the whole subject had not yet been thoroughly investigated. He went on to say that past migrations of altiplano Indians to the lower altitudes had been fatal to a high proportion of the migrants. So in the end, he concluded that before this project goes forward, what is needed is more studies, more biological studies of what he described as Andean biology. So this restrained endorsement of the resettlement project and call for further study of Andean biology suggests the influence of Carlos Monge Medrano. During the mission, Monge acted as a consultant and then wrote an appendix to Beaglehall's report. And at the time when Beaglehall carried out his mission, Monge Medrano's reputation as an international authority on Andean biology and economic development was well established. In an appendix to Beaglehall's report, Monge warned that the ILO project could have devastating consequences for the health of Andean highlanders. Recalling his decades-long concern with Andean biology, Monge wrote that quote, the Andean Indian is attuned to his climactic environment, and generally speaking, anything which tends to keep him there is the best means of ensuring his biological development. He also opposed any project that would sever the ties between Andean Indians and their communities of origin. Though he articulated this concern with resettlement in response to Beaglehall's 1952 mission, Monge had been making similar claims for decades. Since the early 1930s, Monge had conducted research not only on the biological adaptations of Andean bodies, but also on the social policies and procedures that the Inca Empire developed to cope with what he called the climactic aggression of the Andes region. Monge had also positioned this research as relevant to the issues raised in the domain of eugenics and homiculture. For instance, in 1934, during a plenary session at the Second Pan-American Eugenics and Homiculture Conference in Buenos Aires, Monge argued that the problem of biological adaptation to extreme environments was an ancient one that had vexed the Incan Empire. Drawing on textual evidence from the writings of Spanish chroniclers, Monge proposed that the, quote, ancient communist empire of the Incas had developed a sophisticated understanding of the interdependence between the biological and social realms, which was evidenced by their knowledge that highland and coastal peoples suffered when transferred to unfamiliar climates. According to Monge, the Inca Empire had also developed sophisticated solutions to this biosocial problem, which was evidenced by their codification of mitimaes, an institution which he described as producing an incessant interchange of populations that stimulated acclimatization to different altitudes and created a truly cosmopolitan man. Throughout his career, Monge continued to celebrate the ancient wisdom of the Incan Empire. In the years leading up to Beaglehall's mission, Monge expanded his arguments from the Pan-American Eugenics Conference and argued for the superiority of Incan methods for dealing with the biosocial realities of different climates. Monge's case for Incan supremacy can be found at the core of his English language book, Acclimatization in the Andes. In a chapter on racial acclimatization, Monge again turned to colonial-era sources, which he interpreted as showing that the Incas had developed a marvelous and intuitive comprehension of the problem of climactic aggression and had confronted it with a, quote, biological policy which took into account the age-old adaptation of the race to the altitude. according to Monge, the Inca Empire's success owed much to its practice of shifting people around for the purposes of acclimatization and helped to explain how the Incan Empire had attained such an extensive stage of development. So part of what Monge was signaling here was the existence of pre-existing knowledge, knowledge that he identified as going back to the Incas, and a lot of what he was sort of pushing back against was these international projects seemingly sort of superseding that knowledge. Yet, despite Monge's warnings, the ILO and the Peruvian government forged ahead with the Puno Tambopata mission. And in the next phase of the project, ILO officials hired Alfred Métraux, who came, traveled to the Andes region as well as to the Amazon region, to the lower lying valley, and wrote a report that was basically highly critical of Monge's concerns and quite dismissive. And mostly he was arguing from a kind of cultural framework, arguing that that there was no reason to be concerned about the kind of the biological and physiological adaptation of indigenous groups, that it was primarily kind of a matter of having the right sort of public health experts and having the right kind of anthropological expertise. So I think Métraux and Monge's debate concerning the Puno Tambopata project tells us a lot about this time period. It demonstrates how eugenic projects from the interwar period and Cold War development project shared quite a bit of epistemological terrain. So during the interwar period, experts approached modernization and development projects as biohistorical or biosocial phenomenon. And what I highlight in this chapter is that this continues into the Cold War period. So I think that there's been a tendency in the historiography and the historical literature on this time period to think of this moment as one where there's this real kind of schism between the life sciences and the social sciences. And most of the literature on kind of development projects and modernization schemes is written from the perspective of kind of the social sciences. And one of the things I want to highlight here is that biology did not go away and continued to kind of have relevance in these debates. But at the same time, I think the other thing that this debate highlights is that the question of indigenous futures, the question of indigenous development, was widely thought of as a question to be sort of managed by experts, by scientific experts. And it's this attitude and orientation that my book seeks to historicize. So one of the ways in which the kind of specificity of this moment becomes clear, and this is something that I write about in the conclusion to my book, is if we jump forward to the 1960s and 70s and look at the kind of race statements that came out of UNESCO in this time period, we see a kind of a much more sort of expansive reckoning with the kind of social dimensions of racism. So in the 1960s, UNESCO produces two subsequent race statements, 1964 and one in 1964 and one in 1967. The composition of the committees that write those statements is even more diverse than the composition of the committee that writes the 1950 and 1951 statements. It includes experts from sub-Saharan Africa, from South Asia, from the Caribbean. And the statements from this later time period do continue to kind of highlight the need to confront sort of biological determinism and kind of static ideas of racial typologies, but they really begin to introduce other themes like the roots of racism in colonialism, the need to think of racism in sort of systemic terms and even in structural terms. So I think a lot of what my book is seeking to do is to really kind of historicize this sort of immediate period after World War II, the 1950s and 60s, and to say that the kinds of debates that we see here between Monge and Métro are really coming out of kind of earlier periods, like even further back to the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and we have to kind of think about the kind of anti-racism that gets produced in that moment as sort of unique to that period, a kind of a late colonial period is the way I tend to think of it. Thank you. That concludes my talk, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a few minutes for questions, so if anyone would like to get us started. Okay, we'll go. Nanika is writing furiously.
Yeah, hi. I first want to thank you for bridging this gap between the history of science and critical development studies. As a scholar who started in critical development studies, this is like really fulfilling for me to see intellectually. My question was about whether population control and sterilization figure in your story.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I mean, as I pointed out in the talk, there were definite anxieties and concerns about population. What I find really interesting is that in this Peruvian context, it mostly was about kind of the distribution of the population. And some of the people who were also taking part in this debate that I didn't mention were prominent demographers from this time period. So there's not somebody named, I'm blanking on his name, but he was a Peruvian demographer who collaborated with kind of the leading demographers in Princeton. He produced Peru's 1940 census, the first census that Peru ever produced. And a lot of what his kind of demographic analysis showed was that there was this sort of unevenly distributed population, that there was sort of intense concentration along the coast and in the highlands, but then that there were all these other regions that were sort of thinly populated. And he did write quite a bit about kind of the problem of indigenous migration to the coast, to the coastal cities, which was sort of a common theme in a lot of the social science writing from this time period. So this idea, this scheme to resettle indigenous groups in the Amazon region, which is very far removed from the coastal cities like Lima, seems to me like it was sort of a very convenient plan, particularly for folks in the cities who worried that there was that these indigenous migrations were bringing disease and crime and all these other kinds of things. But I haven't seen many reference to sort of population control, population fertility in the context of these debates. And I think that's in large part because at this point, demographers in Latin America were largely concerned with sort of growing their populations and kind of more pronatalist type measures that dovetailed with the kind of public health concerns that I discussed.
Was there encouragement to mix these populations, so in terms of birth, for birth rates?
Yeah.
You need to use to encourage mixing of, say, a mountain person and a valley person, thinking that this would affect strength and lung capacity to require.
You might want to repeat the question. The people on Zoom won't have heard her.
Okay.
Can't hear you without the microphone.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
It's okay.
So yeah,
The question about racial mixing.
So the question, as I heard it, it was about whether there were proposals for race mixing, whether mixing between kind of the populations of the highlands with big lungs, whether that was sort of a solution to this question of adaptation. I guess the short answer is no, and I think that kind of reflects the different conceptions of race that these groups of experts had. So for people like Métro and Kaczynski-Godard and Beaglehole, the problem of, for them, the problem of adaptation was largely seen as a kind of a cultural one and a kind of a problem of infrastructure. They mostly thought that, with the right kind of cultural adaptations and sort of with a robust enough public health infrastructure, these indigenous groups should have no problem adapting to the low-lying tropical valleys. And it was Monghe who really argued for the kind of the biological specificity of indigenous groups in the highlands. And what's interesting is, Monghe is often situated within the history of indigenismo in Peru, and he comes out of a kind of a stream of indigenista thinking in Peru that really emphasized the need to kind of preserve the distinctiveness of indigenous groups in the highlands. And he was thinking of that in kind of both biological and cultural terms. And many indigenistas were very kind of suspicious of race mixing proposals, both on kind of cultural and biological grounds.
We have one more question, and I think we'll...
Okay.
Yeah, I think your last question, we've only got a couple minutes left. So you anticipated this in your conclusion. I was wondering how these ideas about race had changed with UNESCO as we move into the 1960s, and in particular with colonial independence movements in the West Indies, and really concerted efforts at ways of creating own ideas about nation and identity. And I'm assuming that that is part of what informs the 1964 and 67 UNESCO race statements.
Yeah, that's a great statement. So a great question. So I conclude my conclusion in the book. Sort of briefly describes this context and these statements, and I guess really I see it as a kind of turning point. And you're absolutely right. You're pointing to the right context. This context of decolonization, where all of a sudden you get the emergence of these newly independent nations in Africa, in Asia, who are now joining UNESCO, and you really do see a kind of a shift in the discourse that emphasizes questions of national sovereignty, kind of the legacies of colonialism. There's also a lot of in the later statements. There's discussion of things like creating a new international economic order, and I have a chapter in the book that focuses on a conference that took place in Hawaii in 1955, an international conference on race relations. And the idea was to kind of create this sort of international society for the study of race relations. It was a project that was sort of led by U.S. sociologists, and the conference just kind of imploded, and a lot of the reasons for its implosion were due to kind of the failure of you American sociologists to kind of take these things seriously. So I think there is a kind of a real turning point there that you're picking up on.
Great. So unfortunately, we are out of time, although it feels that there's so much more we could discuss. So I invite you, if you do have questions, to please come up afterwards, and folks online will share your questions with Sebastián as well. But I hope you'll all join me in thanking Sebastián for this really fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.